Hello everyone, welcome to Science Friday.
Here's some for E as well. The one on the top here is one of the ways that you can define E.
What makes a field more likely to have an unbalanced gender distribution?
So this can be, like, in the case of this paper, diversification or brain folds.
This goes back to balancing information retention.
It's
incredibly negative. We have to have information privacy.
Is this on? I don't think I'm being projected, am I?
You're being projected outside.
In there, okay. Can you guys hear me in here?
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, so I'm Chelsea. I'm a history teacher here at Nueva, and for as long as I can remember, I've had a passion for historic preservation and for real estate in particular. And so I do have a bit of a background in it. I was a Coro Fellow in Public Policy and worked in the St. Louis Office of Community Development. In the Obama White House, I dabbled in something called Promise Zone housing initiatives, and I also did a Fulbright grant in urban sustainability in Brazil. So I kind of understand the basic building blocks of federal housing policy. But that's actually not what interests me in this at all. What interests me in this topic is simply that I'm in my 30s, I have a baby, and I live in the Bay Area. And the most common conversation I have with my friends is, can we afford to live here? Where do we want to raise our family, and can we buy a house? And that's because buying a house is so intrinsically tied to our quality of life. See if this works. So the Bay Area, turn up the mic. How do I turn it up? Hello?
What are you doing?
Are you turning up the mic?
Turn up. You can't turn up the mic. Okay. Do you want us to stop the presentation while you do that awkwardly?
Are we pausing?
No. Go ahead. I think. I don't know what's going.
Okay, I'm going to keep going. So the Bay Area, and California in particular, has gone from being really the land of golden dreams to America's worst housing crisis. And we see headlines like this about it getting worse and worse all the time, right? With real serious consequences. Things like displacement grows, homelessness grows, people get pushed out to live further into wildfire-prone areas. They have to commute longer. That puts more CO2 into the oxygen, or into the atmosphere, causing greater climate change acceleration. Also entrenching more displacement. Companies are leaving, seeking places for more affordability for their workforce, right? And the list goes on. So my questions are twofold about this. Why is this happening, and what can we do about it? So I am a history teacher, and I know this is Science Friday, but you have to let me meditate just a little bit on some historical context here, right? Property ownership has been entrenched in the American ideal census conception. If we go all the way back to the Jeffersonian agrarian norm, to thinking about single-family homes and white picket fence as the American dream, right? And a lot of this has to do with property as the major mechanism to generate wealth in this country. And that's the way a lot of wealth gets passed down through generations. Cities also have developed along very familiar patterns. We're talking specifically about American cities here. So if we go back to the Gilded Age, this is a time of massive industrialization and factories, but it also pushes us into massive urbanization. We're thinking about skyscrapers and early public transit and electricity, but that also is the same time as tenements and slums and hygiene issues and epidemics. And so what this does is it sparks new utopian visions for how we should live. And if we move on to the mid-century, in the 1950s and 1960s, a combination of the federal highway system and making cars massively available, plus government financial incentives to push people out to the suburbs, changes the landscape of cities in a dramatic way. Because what it does is it deprives cities of their tax base. Those loss of property taxes and loss of companies that left for the suburbs meant that there's no money to pay for infrastructure and upkeep and schools. And so by the 1960s and 70s, many American cities are in a full-blown urban crisis. There's also mechanisms, probably the most famous being redlining, that trap people of color, particularly African Americans, in dilapidated and blighted cities. If we've heard of this before, the short version is it's maps issued by the federal government to banks stating where they can and can't grant mortgages. And where they can't grant mortgages and allow people to buy property is in African American neighborhoods. So all of a sudden we see low and middle income white families being pushed into the middle class in suburbia and trapping for generations African Americans in particular in inner cities and unable to generate that wealth. And then we fast forward to the 2000s and on, and we see the back to the city movement. We see a massive influx of middle and upper middle income Americans moving back to cities in search of shorter commutes, in search of being closer to amenities like walkability and restaurants and museums. And this is great for cities, and that they have more taxes all of a sudden, and their property values go up, and their rents go up, but it also displaces many people. And this is where we get the big G word, right? Gentrification. And so this is where we are now. That's a picture of the Mission, where I live in San Francisco. So why is housing so expensive in the Bay Area? Okay, to get at this, I went to Spur, which is a local policy think tank here in San Francisco, and they look at urban issues like housing and transit. And they did a 4-paper series on housing in the Bay Area. And the first thing they said is, one, the Bay Area simply hasn't built enough homes. So in 1997 to 2018, housing costs increased 127%. And since COVID, it's only skyrocketed, right? It's only gotten worse. If you look at this first figure, I know it's a little tiny. On the x-axis, you have years, and on the y-axis, you have residential building permits issued. And we can see that as the economy has boomed, because it has here, especially with Silicon Valley and tech, and more people have moved, actually the number of permits issued, the number of housing has decreased. That gray is single family zoning, and the orange is multi-unit zoning. So everything before 1980s, we were actually focused on building low density housing. And if you're curious, this dip right here, this is a 2008-2009 housing crisis. That's why it dips so low. And then if we look at figure 2, this is the ratio of jobs to housing. And this is particularly interesting. This column right here is 2011 to 2017. We had an average of 4.7 jobs for every unit of housing built. Take that in for a second. 4.7 jobs for every unit of housing built. San Francisco, even higher than the average, 6.26. San Mateo County, 8.14. And that tells us, closer to tech we get, the more extreme the housing shortage is. We also can talk about an increase in government fees. Hey, raise your hand if you've heard of Prop 13 before. I'm just curious. Okay, so this is an infamous measure passed in 1978, which locked property tax in place and said it could only go up by 2% each year. So for example, my in-laws bought a house in the 1980s in San Francisco. They paid probably a couple thousand in property tax. Today, if they had just bought that house, it would have been more like $25,000 to $30,000 in property tax. So the impact that has is while it can allow people to stay in San Francisco who couldn't afford property tax, the city has to make that up somewhere, right? So what they do is they tax probably disproportionately commercial property, and they also disproportionately tax new housing. And that makes it much harder and much less incentives, right, for people to build new housing in San Francisco. Other thing is, since 2008, I'll take questions at the end. So. 2008, 2009, investors also focused on luxury housing. There's just a bigger turn on reinvestment in that. So we don't see as much low income and middle income housing being produced. There's also been a labor shortage, like many industries in our country right now. In fact, I believe it's the construction union said to meet the national demand, not just the Bay Area, but the national demand, we would need 1 million new construction workers today, right? So we see a massive labor shortage. There's also rising material costs, especially wood and lumber. And a lot of that has to do with our fires going on, and it also has to do with supply chain issues. Lumber can make up anywhere from 10 to 50% of total cost of construction. It's actually significantly high, and that really matters.
Chelsea, cost of construction or cost of home overall? Like, does that include property value?
No, construction. So reason number 2, income inequality is getting worse. If you take a look at this graph, The green is 1999, and it looks at the total income for a family, okay? In 1999, we had a majority of middle income families in the Bay Area, actually. And if you look at the orange, 2018, we have a majority of upper middle class families in the Bay Area. Why? Because high wage occupations are booming, right? A lot of it, has to do with tech and Silicon Valley. And you have more high wage families competing for the same inventory, of course prices are gonna go up. The other thing is, from our historical context that we just figured out, is Black and Latinx households are more likely to live in poverty areas. And this means that any housing legislation that's passed is gonna disproportionately affect them. I'll take questions at the end, okay? So how much housing does the Bay Area need? They went about figuring this out in a really interesting way. They first decided, we're gonna look at historic housing shortfall, because the thinking is people are still living here, they just may be putting a disproportional amount of their salary towards housing, or they may be living in multi-generational households. It doesn't mean there aren't people who are still in need of housing who are living here. And then they also added it to the future demand, projecting in the next 50 years, by 2070, how much housing we think we need. So if we look at historic housing shortfall between 2000 to 2018, looking at the building permits issued, that's where this data is coming from, there's 358,500 units produced, and they figured out we actually need 1 million new units to meet that demand. They calculated this using the employment growth of an average rate of 2%, assuming that if there are jobs, there's people filling the jobs and those people need housing, and then used an income distribution from the year 2000. The reason that matters is because we're thinking about, do you need low-income housing? Do you need middle-income housing? Do you need high-income housing? And that's what this graph is about. And then to think about the future demand, there's no exact science to figuring out population growth, right? So they ran a few different models, and they went with the highest model to play it safe. And so they figured out we need a minimum of 1.5 million new units over the next 50 years. And they calculated this assuming constant income distribution, wage growth, employment trends, so assuming there's no major change in the market going on. And so they added these two together and figured out, okay, over the next 50 years, we need a little over 2 million units of housing. The bottom line is we need to produce twice what we're producing now. This says we need 45,000 units a year. Right now, to give you a sense, we produce 22,000 a year. So how do we double that? Excellent. This would require major paradigm and policy shifts. It would require to change the way we think about housing, not as just a privilege of the wealthy, but what I want to challenge us to today is to think about, what if we were to reframe housing as a human right, something that every person should have access to. Okay, I'm going to run through kind of a whole list of policy solutions, and we can get in depth on any one of these, but I just want to give you a sense of what people are talking about in the field out there. All right, so the first one is changing zoning density, and changing zoning density in single family neighborhoods, near transit, and commercial corridors. So last week, how many of you heard about SB 9 or SB 10? All of it. Okay. All right. So SB 9, Gavin Newsom just signed into law, and it basically eradicates single-family zoning in the state of California, which it doesn't do quite as much as we think, and I can break it down a little bit more. But any single-family house parcel that's over 2,500 square feet can be turned into 4 units. And single-family zoning has a long history of exclusionary policies keeping out certain people, right? There's that historical context that I love. But it is a step in the right direction. 9 other states have similar housing like this pending. Oregon's had this. I used to live in Portland. Oregon's already had this on the book for quite a few years now. So that just happened. Changing zoning, upzoning near transit makes a lot of sense in ways, because if you allow for higher density near ferry terminals, near metro stops, near bus stations, you're kind of killing 2 birds with 1 stone, in that you're lessening congestion and you're helping the environment by having people drive their cars less. So that's the thinking behind that. By the way, zoning is kind of the hidden logic of the city, right? There's a reason you can't have a factory right next to Nueva. There's a reason you can't put a skyscraper in the middle of a residential neighborhood, just so we all know the terms we're talking about. So strengthen state and regional land use laws. Right now, everyone's king of their own kingdom, so to speak. San Mateo has jurisdiction over San Mateo zoning. Burlingame has jurisdiction over Burlingame zoning. And there's no one who holds the big picture. And everyone just kind of passed the buck, especially on low-income housing. There's something called RENA, a regional allocation process, where the state tells each municipality you have to build this many units of housing. But there is absolutely no way to hold the municipalities accountable. There's just no measure to do so. Gavin Newsom has recently sued quite a few municipalities, so we'll see what comes of that. But so far, what we need is new measures to hold municipalities accountable for building units of housing, because they're just not incentivized to do so. So streamline bureaucracy. Probably not surprising. Government red tape can hold things up for many years. An environmental review process can hold up construction for 3 to 5 years. So the SB 10, the law Newsom just recently signed, is trying to get at some of those issues. Eliminate parking requirements. Right now, most residential units require parking. A single stall of parking, depending on the kind of structure it's in, can cost a developer anywhere from $5,000 to $50,000. A single stall, right? Not a parking structure. So thinking about how eliminating parking can open up new opportunities. Expand affordable housing funding. There is so much you can unpack here, but it can look like bonds or tax credits or new taxes, taxing vacant properties. There's a lot of speculation and investors who just hold on to property that goes vacant, so thinking about that. There's calls to reform the infamous Prop 13 and also do different taxes on houses like over 4 million, let's say, so a wealth tax, or changing the percentage of that the property tax goes up under Prop 13. So if you remember, I said it was 2%. There's calls to make it 5 or 6%. So there's a lot of different ways to think about how we expand funding. Place land and buildings in public and nonprofit ownership. This is also known as land banking. It's done by a lot of governments, especially in Europe and Asia. It means that the government takes ownership of the land and gives it out to developers with certain stipulations to develop it for low or middle income housing. Denmark, 15% of their land is land banked. Austria, it's something crazy, like 45%. United States, the first pilot program is going on in Kansas City right now, right? So we're kind of behind the times on thinking about how we divvy up property ownership in this country. Make it possible to build middle income housing. There's a lot of talk around this in San Francisco in particular, because if you think about while the government's incentivizing low income and developers are focused on high income, no one's really focusing on middle income housing. So there's different policy ideas around that. Streamline prefabricated housing production. This is an image here. There's a lot of cool ideas about how, it kind of reminds me of what y'all do in the iLab. Think about it as IKEA furniture, right? How do you prefabricate housing units and they come together? I know that in Stanford, there's actually an interesting initiative having robots build housing for poor income families in Chile going on. So there's some really cool ideas out there with prefabricated housing. And then the last thing is anti-displacement measures. This is things like eviction moratoriums. Those especially gained a lot of traction during COVID, thinking about extending those, having eviction mediation services, having social wraparound services. And that. Can I take questions at the end? Is that okay? All right. Okay, and then this is the last big thing I want to touch on. While it's really interesting to look at policy ideas, I think it's also important to recognize what people are doing on the ground floor, right? What are people dreaming up and just making happen regardless of the government, regardless of what the academic leaders in the field are saying. So the first thing is a tiny house village. This is actually in Portland, Oregon. This is a homeless shelter with wraparound services and tiny homes. This has actually been instituted in quite a few cities since then. I've been there, it's very cool. The problem with things is they get a lot of pushback from NIMBYism. If you heard that term, not in my backyard. And that's because people are so afraid having tiny homes or homeless shelters near them is going to lower their own property values. So that's the fight with this. And the converse of that is the YIMBY protest movement. Yes, in my backyard. That started in San Francisco. Scott Wiener's kind of the leader of this, and they protest to upzone, right, to have more density in housing. We have the container house, alternative materials. Where's Luke? You might recognize that in St. Louis.
Where
Yeah,
was that?
Old North. So this is a guy who built his house out of truck bed containers. And so thinking about how do you get around certain costs and lower costs of development. There's alternative modes of financing, of course. People live, probably the most common is living in a co-op, and you can pay into the co-op and that co-op pays the mortgage. There's nonprofit housing, the most famous being Habitat for Humanity. And they can also channel their homes towards certain causes, right? So for example, in New Orleans, Habitat for Humanity gives their homes to musicians intentionally to promote that culture and keep it intact when the cost of living is getting so much higher in New Orleans. And then the last thing is accessory dwelling units, known as ADUs. These have gone up all over San Francisco lately. They're a way for anyone to put in another unit of housing in their backyard, and we see hundreds of thousands of permits being issued for these in California now. So I'm going to end here, but what I really want you to think about is how we take these dreams and these policy ideas and these grassroots ideas and transform them into creating a more accessible Bay Area, and how we think about reimagining the housing crisis for all. So thanks, everyone. Okay, answer questions?
Yeah, we're gonna give everybody a chance that needs to go.
Awesome. Thank you everybody for coming. Please feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions or if you want to go everything anymore. We're a little over time, so we need to start cleaning up. I'm so happy to see you here. Hopefully you will join us all next week. Thank you so much.